Okay, so this is series 2. We had a previous talk last Tuesday, which was with Southeast performance programming professionals, and we discussed the potentials of performance programming outside in our shared context of the coronavirus pandemic. So this week, I am joined by panelists Diane Dever, Morgan Schofield, Sadie Hurley, and Matthew Jones. And just to let the audience know, the way that this evening will work is we have 3 questions and all panelists will have a chance to answer the questions, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. And I really do urge you to chip in and ask any questions you might have at the end. So the 3 questions that we have are: question 1, what challenges might we face when we go outside, and what resources do we already have to ensure our collective success when we do? Question 2, being that public space is shared by all, how are organizations ensuring that they cater to minority audiences, for example, our BME, LGBTQ and neurodiverse siblings, as well as mainstream audiences? And question 3, how can we ensure health, safety and well-being without compromising on artistic integrity? So without further ado, we'll jump straight into question 1. Joseph, I'm going to ask you if you'll be the first respondee for question 1, please. Shall I prompt you with the question again?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so question 1, what challenges might we face when we go outside, and what resources do we already have to ensure our collective success?
I think that from kind of my experience working in Folkestone, and I should say that I think a lot of my experience performing outdoors has taken place in Folkestone. I think that's one of the really amazing things about that landscape and the town, which is that you have this really amazing, powerful, poetic place in which to situate your practice. I think one of the challenges that comes with that is actually a kind of sense of overwhelm within the work, and I think what that translates to, I guess, in like kind of concrete terms, is something to do with a question of how you work with a site, right? Like how do you respond to site? How do you work with its minutiae and intricacies in a way that isn't super extractive, in a way that isn't kind of complicit in processes of gentrification? How do you respond poetically in collaboration with the landscape, with the site, whatever it is, and not let it overwhelm the work that you're trying to do? So that's a kind of twofold one. There's a kind of like poetic performance challenge, and then also something about the specific locality within which you're situating your work, but they're both kind of orbiting the same question, which is to do with specificity, which is to do with generosity, which is to do with towards the place and the people that you're working with, which is to do with respect also. But I think when we're often used to being inside, the way those questions now force us to change our practices, to adapt what we do, adapt our approaches, I think we have to think very carefully about just what that shift means. And in terms of resources, ensuring our collective success, that was the phrase, right? I think local knowledge always, like when you know, wherever it is in the town or the county that you're working, research, in practical concrete time, spending time in the place, sitting with it, being with it, talking to people, listening to the place. I think all of those in real and in concrete and more felt ways, I think can be very useful and necessary.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think Bean and I lived in Diane's inbox for about the first year that we arrived in Folkestone, trying to access as much local knowledge as possible. And I really like your comment on the sensitivity when you're dealing with a place that's such a immense natural resource as Folkestone as well. But I like this idea of sensitivity also expanding over into sensitivity to the social context as well. Thank you, Joseph. Diane, could I ask you to be second response to question number 1, please? Shall I prompt you with the question again? Oh, unmute, please.
The first of the session. No, I think I'm all right. Thanks, Benjamin, and it's lovely to be here this evening with the rest of the panel. I really like what you said, Joseph, about the context. I mean, of course, naturally, it is an amazing landscape, but I think more specifically, I mean, and that's just for granted. We're so lucky living by the sea and between the hills and sort of France. But the social context is particularly important for me because, you know, as artists or producers or, you know, cultural programmers, to really sort of cite yourself in your environment is so critical for the work to mean something, because often when you go outside, your audience isn't necessarily who you've invited. So there's always the sort of encounter, which I think is what makes being outside so sort of vital actually to how I want to sort of make work or see work made. And you know, Folkestone is a complex place. It really is. I mean, everywhere is complex, you could argue. But you know, you put something on in Tontine Street or in the centre of the town, and you know, we need to think about who's going to encounter that and what they go away with. And I don't think it matters whether they completely know what's happening, but that they feel that encounter is of sort of value and there's some enrichment in it, even if it's just prompting curiosity. But also that we live in a town where those things can happen, and people are, you know, an encountered audience is up for those things that we put in the street in front of them. So I feel that's a really important thing to think about, and not to gloss over those challenges that you know is everyday life in Folkestone. As those of us that know Folkestone really intimately, you know, Tontine Street, for example, is a really challenging environment to pass through on a day-to-day basis. And I think we all live and breathe that. We don't pretend it's not happening, you know, and I think that's really critical to making work outside. And then just on the point of the resources that we have, and I think, I mean, you touched on it a little bit, Benjamin, it's so important, and so did you, Joseph, that local knowledge and wanting to know that local knowledge and really enjoying kind of picking through things and really understanding where you are and who you're with. And so I would say friends and collaborations and partnerships and how that evolves over time really means that the work that we all make together, you know, is that sum, it's greater than the sum of its parts, you know, that sort of way of looking at things. And of course nowadays with the pandemic, you know, it is more challenging, but I think I've really enjoyed recently that we seem to be not so fearful and people are back outside and it is okay, and with respect and sort of care, we're moving through that. And the last conversation, Benjamin, that you hosted, we were talking a little bit about the type of work that works in that situation, and maybe we'll come on to that a bit later. But yeah, I think that's probably where I'll leave it for now.
Thanks, Diane. I really like this idea of the encounter and what you were saying about Tontine Street. You know, when performance-based moved to Folkestone, we very quickly ended up in a space that had a glass front window to the street. So everything we did was an encounter, be it studio, be it event, be it preparation or just a day off, you know. And I think so much can spring out of that, and this idea of encounter as a resource is huge. Thank you, Diane. Sadie, could I ask you to unmute and come in with an answer, a response to question 1, please? Shall I prompt you again?
I've got it written down actually. I think I'm all right.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, it's great to be here. this question, I was sort of thinking about it in the context of the company that I co-run, because a lot of our work is in public spaces anyway, and that brings with it quite a lot of challenges, and is quite an unpredictable environment to working in a normal context. But then to add in a pandemic and the sort of social distancing and the guidelines that we have to abide by brings a sort of another level of planning and sort of so I suppose I think probably got more questions than answers to these questions, but it sort of makes me think about talking about those encounters, like both Joseph and Diane were speaking about. That's sort of what we do and what we like, particularly with the Advent calendar. It's a very we want people to come across it and happen upon it and come in, walk through the door and see something that they weren't expecting. And I suppose thinking about how we move forward with that, thinking about whether free events that we run become ticketed, free ticketed. But when you do that, you also are losing those sort of organic encounters of someone just coming in. So it's sort of how to keep that at the forefront of what we do, but make sure that we keep everybody safe as well. Also, we do quite a lot of work down in the amphitheatre, which is a big outdoor space, and it's normally quite a busy event. And it's sort of, you sort of think about how in the current climate that would work, and where our responsibility ends as well as event organisers if we start to corner an area off that is for our performance, and then people start to congregate at the barrier. Is that our response as organisers? How do we deal with that? And I think those are all the things that we're thinking about as an organisation at the moment. About how to move forward and keep people safe, and do, I think working with the council as well to sort of what they need to allow events to happen in spaces like that. Also, I suppose in terms of sort of the collective success and resources, I think it's something that we should probably all be doing anyway, but I think even more it's about sharing our resources and having really joined up thinking, and sort of also knowing that we're going to make mistakes and things are probably going to go wrong, and to talk about them, not shy away from them and sort of hide them, but actually discuss them with other organisations about how, have you come across this, how did you deal with it, and sort of just sharing the sort of load, I think, and helping each other, and to enable us all to move forward in the current situation, I think.
Thank you, Sadie. This question of where the responsibility lies, like zones and lines of responsibility, this is something that Diane, you prompted us with last week, and I think it would be great if we could all make a little note of that and possibly have a bit more of a chat about that together in the Q&A, because it's something that really is coming to the foreground of a lot of conversations. Thank you, Sadie. If you just jump back on mute for us, and Matthew, if you could please unmute and give us your response to question 1. Shall I prompt you with the question, or do you have it in front of you?
No, it's all right, I've got it. Thank you, Benjamin. Hi to everyone. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for having me. I think the first thing, just looking at that idea of challenge, is making work for the outdoors needs to always think that it is for the outdoors. The outdoors is a creative space in itself. It's a creative environment. And it's quite different from many other environments. So I always feel that the challenge is to go, we start from this place of being outdoors. We don't start from being indoors or any other kind of environment and then import into the outdoors. We start outside and we respond to that world as it is and as it changes. And I think the thing to be very, very kind of aware of is that many of the assumptions that we might make about work that we do in other environments do shift once we move outdoors. So, the style of work, the content of work, the way in which you present work, the kind of audiences that you encounter, all these are quite different from the ways in which more curated spaces operate. And and it means that the experience and the dynamic is quite a special one, because it has got that feeling of change, and coming with that feeling of change, the dynamic around people moving, the dynamic around weather, the dynamic around light, all of those kind of things mean this is quite a different experience. When you go into those theatre spaces and things like that, a lot of what we're seeking to do in those places is control the experience and make the experience something that we know is going to be like this in order to achieve a specific outcome. When you work in the outdoors, there are a multiplicity of things going on all the time, and many of which you can't control at all. And you're kind of like working with this strange, malleable space that you still want to bring your work to the fore in this space. And I think that one of the challenges therefore becomes, because it is very dynamic, is working out both who your work is for, who you're trying to reach through this work, but then also who do you accidentally reach? Because there is constantly this thing that goes on, which goes like, there's the people I've kind of invited, or I've publicized to, or I've made this work with this intention in my head, and then there are the people who just rock up. Okay, what's their experience as well, and how do we make sure we've catered for that experience? So I think for me those are kind of like quite sort of fundamental. I'm not sure it is a challenge so much as an excitement, I think, about working outdoors, and it's one of those things that's a thrill, but it does come with a whole set of different thinking and different responses and different sensitivities. I think in terms of resources, I tend to work on a principle that goes like, sort of artists can be trusted, generally speaking, which goes, actually, if you go, here is a new environment, here is a challenge, here is an opportunity, and as long as you make that opportunity without massive barriers or thresholds that are too high for people to get across, then most practitioners are good at going, I do have a response to this moment in time, or this space, or whatever it happens to be. And so I have a lot of faith in essentially community of artists, and I think that is a resource that exists in Folkestone. Of course, it operates, exists elsewhere, but it is very, very evident in Folkestone that that's there. I would totally support what Joseph said earlier, and I think Diane, you touched on a bit about local knowledge. I think local knowledge is absolutely key to doing good outdoor work. I think, yes, of course, there is generic outdoor work that kind of works, but it doesn't have that resonance, and it doesn't have that depth, and it doesn't have that meaningfulness. And I think for me, it's kind of that whole business of going, there are, in my notes I wrote down, quirky corners and public places, and it's knowing those ones and knowing the dynamic of those weird little bits where you could do something really odd and exciting, and then those big open grand spaces where you need to look at the spectacular and things like that. So that, I think, is really key, but it's a resource that's in spades in Folkestone. I think the whole principle behind communal celebration, I think, is a resource, because I think people want it. I think there's a desire and a need, and I think outdoor art services that need really, really powerfully. And I think that to position yourselves to offer that service back to a community, which is about communal celebration, it's about civic pride, is incredibly important. To offer opportunities for people who don't necessarily know each other to come together in quite a convivial environment. And again, that's what outdoor arts, I think, does, is a massive contribution towards how communities and towns come together and actually live together in a happy way. That's me.
Thank you, Matthew. I loved this idea of the double-edged blade of the weather and the light and accidental audiences being both a challenge and a really exciting resource, because it's absolutely true. Thank you very much. Sadie, would I be able to ask you to be the first respondee to question 2? Question 2 is, being that public space is shared by all, how are organizations ensuring they can cater to minority audiences, for example, our BME, LGBTQ+, neurodiverse siblings, as well as mainstream audiences?
Yeah, I think using accessible spaces is always really important, and a space that people can physically get to, and I mean, obviously not all spaces like that, and like Matthew was saying, sometimes there is something really magical about those spaces that you don't know about or are sort of tucked away and things like that. But I think using accessible spaces is really important. And I mean, I think it's slightly different. It's not necessarily going outside, but I think in this current situation, the sort of online aspect of work, whether that be promoting the performance or live streaming or having some sort of online, is to sort of not assume that everybody has access to equal access to the internet and to hardware like iPads and things like that. So I think in terms of a lot of the community theatre and applied theatre work that I do, is sort of thinking about how within projects, whether there's additional funding to go for to get hardware, so that the community groups that we work with can be, you know, can engage with the work and make sure that those sort of constraints aren't there. I think also there's lots of people have a different everyone's has a different level of what they're okay with at the moment. Some people are quite, you know, happy to go out and be in public spaces, but some people still don't feel like that, and I think that's okay. But it's just to sort of be aware of that and how you can engage with those people, or whether you can. It's like a question whether you can engage with people. And I think also, as much as possible, it's nice to try and make work or engage local community groups in the work that we're doing, particularly, and opening up discussion about how we can make it more accessible, and what things can we put in place to make people feel happy and comfortable coming out of their homes and going to see a public performance, and also the work that we're programming as well, I suppose. But yeah, I think it's that local knowledge thing as well, which everyone's touched on, sort of knowing the place that you're performing in, or that you're programming the work in, and that, you know, who lives in that area and what the audience is like, and what you can do to make sure that they want to come and feel comfortable coming, I suppose.
Thanks, Sadie. Diane, could we jump over to you? Can you unmute for me, please? And shall I prompt the question again, or you're good?
No, I think I'm good. So, I mean, I am completely motivated by the politics of public space. That's the thing that has made me do most of the things that I do. And I moved to Folkestone probably 16 years ago, and the sort of demographic makeup on the surface anyway is different to what it is now. And that's a great thing to witness, and it will carry on as you know, more people move here, and as things just change generally in our attitudes and behaviour. And I thought this was an interesting word, cater, you know, when one caters for something, because that suggests a sort of, you know, a wishing to sort of serve and look after, you know, it's a generous word, but for me it also comes with, not the word itself, but when I think about the sort of the three groups that are outlined in the question, even though I hate that sort of word, groups, but we do have to intentionally think about it. I think we're all probably white here in this conversation. And one way that I can, through the work that, so if we think about Harbour Arm, which is really mainstream audience, I would suggest, if you just wanted to be really broad brush about it, and then the sort of Folkestone Fringe art side of things, you know, it moves perhaps, I would say Fringe is still quite mainstream, although it's, you know, arts, more in the arts field. And so the Harbour Arm, I think the way we might cater for it there is by how people feel, whether they feel comfortable. So whether different audiences feel like that space is okay for them, or whether they're noticed or highlighted, you know. I remember when we did, oh my God, the Kate Bush dance thing. I don't know if anyone remembers that. And, you know, the arm was full of all men and women and, you know, other genders in red dresses. And it was such an amazing day. But it wasn't really until I got told stories about groups of people walking home to Sandgate, and that it became something that people noticed and talked about, that made me realise, and jeered at, and that's nothing to hold against Sandgate itself, but just that actually it is a space in and of itself where one perhaps doesn't have to worry so much about what other people might say. So that makes me feel really positive about the Harbour Arm, even though it's quite mainstream, really. And then through the Fringe work, it's the partnerships, I think, that we have and the people that we bring in to work with. So Fringe is all white, and we're really aware of that. And, you know, our work, this Festival of Looking and the partnerships that we have with Black History Month, which had were evolving anyway. It wasn't, you know, a kind of, you know, there were conversations that Georgie, the curator, was already having with Ida and Arike. But given, you know, that Black History Month in October, Black Lives Matter has been happening, it felt very timely for that to be happening for us. But again, it wasn't something that we sat down and said, oh, we really must, you know, think about this in more detail. Of course, you're always having those conversations. And then if I think about, you know, our normal Festival of the Brain programming, neurodiversity is always something that we're kind of catering for, working with, thinking about. I mean, Susanna at Living Words, you know, it's a big important thing of their work. And, you know, by working with others, you learn to do that better. So that's a slightly elongated answer, but I hope, yeah.
That was great, Diane, thank you. There was a lot in there. And I think this question of how do people feel? Do people feel well? Do people feel good? You know, as you were mentioning on the Harbour Arm, I think that's a really good barometer in relation to this question. And I'm really also glad you brought up Black Lives Matter and in relation to programming, and how it wasn't just a knee-jerk reaction, that since the movement had a resurgence at this particular moment, you were already having these conversations. And I think it's really important that we are already having these conversations, because we don't ever want anything to be tokenistic and reactionary. Like, it needs to be something coming from our cause as organizations as well. Thank you. That was excellent. Matthew, could I ask you to unmute, please, and come in on question number 2 for us?
Thank you, Benjamin. I tend to kind of think about this as an issue that you approach from 2 ends, which is, first of all, approaching it from the perspective of access, and secondarily approaching it from the perspective of curation, because ideally you want those two to kind of meet somewhere in the middle and join together. The first thing at the moment that I think is about access is looking about how do you lower barriers to access. And the primary one at the moment we're faced with is anxiety. And I think there are many ways in which, and I'm not particularly going to outline those now, because I think we may come on to those in any case in the next question, but I think lowering people's anxiety about engaging with work is a priority at the moment. But I also think one of the things that we need to be careful about is, just because that happens to be a priority right now, is we don't abandon lowering other barriers to access, and those other barriers are ones that you'll be very familiar with. I'm sure everybody in this group will be familiar with, but I think first and foremost, a barrier to access is, what does the program look like? Because what makes people approach work is when they can see something that they can relate to, and they go, that is clearly for me, that clearly is meaningful for me, and that is clearly something that I have that I have a relationship with. So I think the first and foremost, ironically, whilst I'm separating out the idea of curation and putting these at two ends of a spectrum, ironically, I feel that programming in an inclusive way is the first way of lowering a barrier to access, because it is that thing about it's about modeling, and it's about saying, actually, that's me, I'm there, I'm part of it, I'm already part of it, I'm in the brochure, I'm on the publicity, blah, 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 all those kind of things. So I have a reason to be there. So they already recognize that I have a part to play, whether it's as an audience member or as a participant or as an artist. And then we move on to those other barriers for access, which outdoor arts absolutely is really good at managing. So things that are free is a huge difference that it makes to work. Paying for tickets is the biggest barrier out there to participation and access. The fact that outdoor arts can often be physically accessible in a way that other art forms are not. It is perfectly possible to be very physically accessible in outdoor environments. And there are good people out there who can guide you through that process if you want that kind of advice. And there are lots of people who've done that historically. Open spaces are naturally welcoming. And not only are open spaces naturally welcoming, the fact that you bring people into those open spaces can actually make those places more secure than they previously were. So actually bringing people into parks and things like that, which people might feel anxious about, actually makes them more accessible, actually makes them more friendly, makes them where you might bring your children, whether you might otherwise might not have done. Disability access, we are, I'm sure, aware of, but it is important to start to think about the fact that in outdoor arts, it is possible to do signing, it is possible to do surtitling, it is possible to audio describe. All these things can be done. So for me, first and foremost, and I slightly want to put a slight challenge to the question, because I do think there is a distinction between minorities and diversity, and also context, which is, of course, black and brown people are the majority in our world, even if they're not the majority in Folkestone. And so we need to bring those contexts to bear when we discuss these kind of things. Disabled people self-identified as disabled is a very significantly growing part of our population. And that demographic is shifting a lot, partly because we're an aging population, but it is changing. But just to go on to the curatorial end, I think to proactively program from the perspective of diversity, from the perspective of inclusion, is absolutely important. And it doesn't necessarily take huge amounts of money, but it takes directed money and targeted money. And it's a proactive, conscious effort to do that. And the interesting thing about that, I think, in my experience, is that if you bear in mind the accidental audience that you get in outdoor work, and you curate from a perspective that goes, will this work in that context? Actually, it's remarkable how much you can introduce. And I don't particularly want to bring lots of anecdotal stuff, but I'm going to bring one in, which is at Greenwich and Docklands festivals, we created a piece called Beautiful Thing, which was based on Jonathan Harvey's book about a gay relationship, two boys growing up in Thamesmead, very working class, and at that time, fairly rough estate in Thamesmead. We then took that show and made it into a piece and put it back into Thamesmead. Thamesmead has shifted a lot. It's no longer a white working class place. It's largely West African community who it is thought do not have a very positive attitude towards gay relationships. But actually the very nature of putting something into a collectively communal celebratory experience meant we could do something that was very, very overtly a gay story in that context, and we got no comeback whatsoever from that community. They absolutely embraced it and absolutely celebrated it. So I think from a perspective of curation and commissioning, you can make things work. You clearly need to take people with you, but you need to have that idea about what the accidental audience is all the time. And I tend, whether this is constraining or not, I tend to kind of go, okay, is it going to work for a family? And that's a kind of a bit of a guiding light where I work, because if I can say, actually, maybe it won't work in that context, then I will look to make sure I can make it work in a different kind of setting. But that is a bit of a guiding light for me, which is, does it work for a family? Because I think you're so much encountering families in an outdoor world. There you go.
Thank you, Matthew. Again, there's a lot in there. That was fantastic. I really love this idea of what does a program look like, and that being the easiest way to address diversity and access within programming. You know, we recently were called in by an individual within our community, because even though our programs quite often look and are very diverse, we had a series of 3 lectures that were all by white people around queer theory. And we got called in about it, just saying, why has this happened? It looks like it's not for me as a person of color. And I had, yes, like, I totally agree. And it's not even something that we can take a break from or take a rest from, because the moment that a program doesn't look like it's for someone, it is alienating to someone. But I also had a question in relation to something you said, Matthew. I just want to put a question mark next to it, because in relation to this question specifically, you said that open space is naturally welcoming. And I would personally disagree. And actually, as a queer non-binary person, I feel quite at risk in open space, and I'm much more drawn and feel welcomed in cultural spaces and venues and clubs and theatres and performance spaces. And I would have a big question mark next to whether open space is naturally welcoming or not, actually, in relation to this question. Thank you, Matthew. That was excellent. Joseph, would you please bring us some insight into question 2 from your perspective?
Sure, thank you. And thanks everyone already. This feels like a really rich chat, and I appreciate the way that everyone is talking about and gesturing towards questions of access. But I think maybe what I want to offer, bouncing off what Benji was just saying, yeah, this thing of like of public space not necessarily being safe and not necessarily being welcoming and not necessarily feeling like it is for you. And I think it's great to hear and think about the ways that we can create temporary spaces that are for us. But I think the flip side of this is about when work can kind of exist almost as a provocation in a place. And I don't mean that in a kind of like aggressive or confrontational sense, but I mean, maybe provocation is the wrong word. But I think, you know, like Benji says, with a lot of the programming that performance space does, we are working with artists who experience some kind of minoritization, or various intersecting elements of that. And I feel like one of the key reasons that we work with those artists is that often they have the most urgent and necessary things to say, in terms of what their work is about, what it means. And I think that there's a value to claiming space, like to claiming, situating a particular work, a particular body, a particular way of being in the public sphere. And I think we touch on questions of how we hold that later. But I think it's both. It's like not either or, right? But it is both. How is this for everyone, and at the same time, how is this for the people that really need it? Like, how is this for the not for the majority in this town? How is this for the minorities? And I think that's really important. And then also this question that Matthew was talking about of navigating the families, right? Navigating and everything that's contained within family with a capital F, navigating straightness and cisness in the public sphere, and actually how important it can be sometimes to poke that, if you're prepared to gently, not to be aggressive or dangerous, or to really to put yourself as a minoritarian person at risk. But I think that there is a real value in doing that. I think very clearly there's lines of the kind, performance space supports all kinds of transgressive practices, and there's lots of work that we wouldn't invite someone to do along the harbour. But I think there is a real value to just working a little bit to kind of pull on some threads of tension, or to just highlight some things that are often invisible, or to, yeah, I hope that makes sense.
It absolutely does. Thank you, Joseph. This is something that's also come up in the previous week, which is this balancing act between how do we make something for everyone, and at the same time acknowledging that not everything is for everyone. And so we have this problematic that we're constantly juggling with, particularly and explicitly in public space. Thank you. I've just been prompted that we're getting tight on time. So very quickly, coming into question 3 for our bonus round. Question 3, how can we ensure health and safety and well-being without compromising on artistic integrity? Who have I not asked to go first? Matthew, can you please lead on this question for us? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Benjamin. So, well, I think, again, 2 bits to this. One I think is I just wonder very slightly whether what actually is engaging here is whether being outside and all the things that come with being outside is actually a challenge to integrity, or whether it's actually a challenge to imagination. And what I'm intrigued by is the way in which artists respond and producers respond to an environment which goes, actually, I can achieve something valuable and meaningful, but which acknowledges context. And I think it comes back to almost the thing I was saying at the very beginning, which is the nature of outside is so dynamic that you are forced into that responsive relationship with the world that you're in, rather than, let us say, and I work a lot in theatre, a quite controlling relationship to the space you're in, which then means that actually the response to what you can do and how you make people safe and you ensure well-being and those kind of things is not so much a challenge to artistic integrity, but it is a challenge to the way in which you come up with an imaginative response to all those different pressures and issues and conflicting challenges that you've got to deal with. So I think that's if you like, as a producer, that's my response to that question. As a practitioner, kind of going, I think there are ways through this. I think there's actually an awful lot of really, really good practical advice starting to get out there now, and there are lots and lots of links. I could list a few of them, and I might mention a few. But what I would really say is I think we're now getting to a point where we have a cohort of practitioners who really do understand what's going on with the pandemic, and actually are starting to develop quite cogent and quite effective responses to it. And whether those are to do with things that go, whether it is the social distancing, whether it is pre-booking but not making it ticketed, or not making it with a price on the ticket, whether it is shifting the nature of performance and all those kind of things. Actually, we now already have not a massive, but we have a small body of work out there which we can turn to. And I would say there are a number of really, really good, and they're good because they know it makes them, frankly, very useful to the sector, production managers and others who are really hot on this stuff now and can help and are willing to help people who are looking to make work in the outdoors and make that work safe and make sure that we are being able to still be out there performing in the midst of a pandemic. I think that and this is quite boring, but I would just basically go, there are a number of places you could go if you were looking for just straightforward advice, and that would be people like Without Walls, Attitude is Everything, Access All Areas, National Association of Street Artists. All these people are putting together guidelines, and they're good guidelines and they're useful guidelines. But probably first and foremost, I would go, if you're looking for somebody who can really help you through this, and it is a bit of a minefield, let's face it, a really good production manager who's already managed to do something this year is probably your best port of call. And that's just a really boringly practical piece of advice. If anybody wants to know a few, I probably know a few. There you go.
Thank you, Matthew. Matthew, could I ask that little list that you just spoke of?
Yeah, I can.
Entering it into the chat for us, and I think
yeah, sure,
that might be useful for the audience as well as us, actually. Thank you, Matthew. Next for question 3, can we please have Sadie?
Hiya. I think as a producer, or when you're producing an event or curating an event, I suppose this question made me think about how we take on that responsibility of the health and safety and the well-being of the audience, so that the artist that we have commissioned to make the work doesn't have to, obviously they do have to think about it, but how we can sort of take that burden, I suppose, so that they don't have to compromise what they're doing by thinking about that all the time, which is just a practical thing anyway, I suppose, that you do when you're producing and putting on work outside. As the managers of that event, you sort of take on those responsibilities. I think also being versatile and being open to change and having alternative plans as well. I think probably that's again, like Matt was saying, these sort of really practical things, but having plans in place for if this happens, if that happens, if we go up a tier the day before the live performance is meant to happen and that's not happening anymore, how do we sort of plan for that? And I suppose in terms of applying for funding for up and coming events, those are all things that we need to think about anyway as organisations and as artists of, what's the alternative? Do you postpone? Is there a way that you can programme work that works well in an outdoor space with a live audience, as well as in an outdoor space without a live audience being filmed, for example? So I think just thinking of ways to keep versatile, and again, like I said earlier, about just communicating with other organizations, and like Matt was saying, speaking to people who have already run events during this pandemic, and sharing that sort of knowledge. I think that's all I had for that one.
Thank you, Sadie. I appreciate that. Joseph, would you please help us with your response to question number 3, and then we'll finish up with Diane before Q&A.
Sure. I mean, I think the responsibility for this is this is my response is kind of bouncing off my response for the last one, which was to do with what it means to take up space as a marginalized person in public performance, doing something that is strange or out of the ordinary, or invites the spectatorship of the accidental public, and might unfortunately invite more than that. I think kind of really concrete things that have been useful. One is frank communication between the curators and the artist, the producers, the organization, and the artist, so that everyone knows the potentials and the risks. It's about again, spending time in the place, getting to know the site, getting to know the place, getting to know what it feels like to be there. It's about having contingency plan in place in case performances need to be interrupted or stopped, or otherwise altered. It's about having good communication on the ground and knowing where you have allies in case you might need them. It's about having allies at the site. And there was one more that I wanted to say, but it's floated out of my head. No, it's gone.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, Joseph. Diane, if you could join us for question 3, and then we will open up to a Q&A, and I have some questions to maybe get us going.
Okay, I'll be very brief. Artistic integrity. So I think this is about who you work with and where you site the work. Maybe you don't have the choice. Maybe the work has to take place in a particular location because, you know, that's what the work requires. But if we're thinking about artistic integrity, if you can work with people that really understand what you're trying to achieve and are prepared to look at the health and safety required in a more open way, then I think, you know, that those sorts of relationships are really key. And I think in Folkestone, we're lucky. There are lots of people around us that have access to sites that do understand the nature of making work outdoors. And, you know, as you say, Joseph, that some of this work maybe isn't straightforward or necessarily purely for families. And it's so important that that work happens in the public realm to move conversations on, even if it is challenging sometimes. And then the other, which is, you know, so who are our gatekeepers and how do we build relationships with them, and why are we citing it where we're citing it, despite the health and safety needs, and, you know, what is well-being? So is it only about making sure everybody's cared for, but is it also about the well-being of the town, so that if we don't have these difficult conversations, for example, then there's some well-being that isn't being addressed there. Just perhaps thinking about some of the work that Performance Space you know, want to and do put on for the benefit of all of us, and you know, where we need to be as a society. And then the other end of that conversation, which is very different, is in these times, digital isn't, you know, the solution. That need to be in real time with real people. And so I think it's already been said, how's the work going to change in relation to those two environments? And you know, the pandemic probably isn't going anywhere for a while. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that impacts on the work that's made, and you know, health and safety needs and things like that. But probably we'll forever be changed by this, how we relate to people, what spaces mean, the joy of being able to be back outside. And I think, you know, when we sort of zoom out in a couple of years, it will be interesting to sort of reflect on the impact that it's had on us as humans.
Thank you, Diane. Great response and a great way to wind us up for the Q&A. Well, I actually have some questions that might get us rolling, actually. Well, first of all, to all of my guests, all the guest panelists, do any of you have any direct questions for each other? Is there anything else that you would like to directly ask of each other? And if not...
So would you like, Benjamin, would you like me to just maybe come back on that point about open space and safe space?
I'd love you to, yes.
Just as a thing, because I think what I'm meant by that, and I think you're probably right to pull me up on the word of naturally in that context, which is, and I'm going to use another kind of maybe dodge word here, but actually I think it's about the colonization of space for the purpose of creating safety for lots of different people. And I think one of the things that outdoor arts is very good at is going, actually, by bringing lots of people together into otherwise what can sometimes be quite difficult spaces, or can be places where people do not feel comfortable or do not feel secure, actually security can be created. And I would probably suggest, you know, actually the experience of Pride is one of those instances where that's about the colonization of space, which creates safety. And the more of those that you can do, and the more that you can do them in a diverse way, the greater the possibility of using those spaces become. But I absolutely take your point, and I think probably just saying they're just naturally safe is probably not appropriate. But I think the point is that outdoor arts is a mechanism, and it's a tool for creating safer space. And I see it as that, and I see it as a means of taking stories and issues into places where they actually would struggle to find a voice otherwise. And actually it's a way of communicating with a large number of people at one time, which often is the thing that creates change very effectively and fast. So I chip that in there as a response to your question and your challenge.
Thank you, Matthew. I wasn't challenging. It was just a question mark. I very much agree with what you've just said in relation to the occupation of space and the potentials of performance. And it was that idea of the potential of occupying space was something that Joseph also echoed earlier. I had 2 points come up in the panel that were also raised in the previous week, and they were this idea of like the double-edged blade of how do we make work for everyone, and the very real fact that not all work is for everyone. And I just wanted to maybe ask if anyone could have any more of a specific response, musings or thoughts to that idea. This idea that we are trying to make work for everyone with the knowledge that not everything is for everyone, and it shouldn't necessarily be so. Please jump in.
This probably won't come out in a very succinct way, but I think it's about the intention behind the work. So if, you know, what's the work for? Who's it for? Is it being put outside? Why is it outside? Is it being put outside because, you know, that context is important? Is it being put outside to, Joseph used the word poke people, you know, in a nice way, or maybe not? You know, what are we trying to achieve? And I think that's also probably different for different artists and different producers and different curators. It's also different depending where you are. So putting something on, this is probably a really silly example, but in a street in London that has a diverse population, compared to putting it on in Folkestone, is going to have a different meaning, perhaps. I mean, you talked, Matthew, about the piece that you put on in Thamesmead, and I think all of those things are really important to consider and actually to make part of the work. You know, the context is kind of everything when you're outside. And then a bit of what Sadie said is you may not always get it right. You know, you may think by doing this here because of these reasons. They could be purely artistic and or curatorial, but it doesn't work, or it doesn't, you know, happen the way you thought it might. And I think there's also rich learning in that. And yeah.
Thank you, Diane. Would anyone else like to respond to that?
I think if I might say one of the things, and it partly relates to that experience in terms of me, which is I think the issues that you can bring to the fore are pretty much everything. I think what is really interesting about outdoor arts is it lends itself towards techniques that are quite inclusive in all sorts of different kinds of ways. There are things that I mean, again, the whole business of lowering barriers, for instance, which goes like, if you ask a question about would somebody go and see something that they probably wouldn't necessarily agree with in the context where they're going to have to pay a £15 or a £25 ticket for, well, the answer is no, they're not. But if you then place that into a public space where they encounter it kind of accidentally, that the level of commitment to what's going on there is much lower, the techniques that are being put in front of you are deliberately engaging because very necessarily by being outdoors they have to be. What happens is that the very nature of outdoor arts as an art form, and this is why I strongly want to promote it as an art form, draws people in, and that then allows you the opportunity to talk about the things you want to do. And I recognize there probably are, as Joseph said, there are probably some lines you can't cross, but I don't think there are any conceptual lines you can't cross. I think there may be certain things you just couldn't get away with, but in general, the way in which outdoor arts works as an art form is all about drawing people in who didn't necessarily expect to be there. And then they encounter the concepts that you're putting forward.
Just to jump, oh, sorry.
No, please.
No, just on that sort of, yeah, I suppose it was more of a question, I suppose, is like, how do we, when you want to do things like that and program work that on the face of it isn't for a particular group of people, but once they come into that space or happen to walk through that park, realize that, just thinking as an example of an opera performance we put on for the Advent calendar, which we were, we weren't sure how it was going to be, people were going to respond to it. It was a secret, so people didn't know what it was going to be, and people turning up who would never have paid, for a ticket to see some opera, but had such a lovely experience and found it very, sort of taking something down off its pedestal, I suppose, and putting it in close proximity to somebody. And I suppose my thinking is like, how do we keep those feelings of being physically close to things, that makes things more, in a way, sometimes more accessible, or changes them. How going forward do we keep that feeling when we aren't allowed to be close to each other physically, and I haven't got an answer. It's just amusing of how do we sort of try and keep connected and keep those feelings in the forefront of what we do without being physically close, I guess. Oh, you're on mute there, Ben.
Very important question, Sadie, and thank you for raising it. I saw Andre's camera flicker on and off. Is that for a question, Andre? Brilliant. Would you like to unmic and come on in?
Hi, hello everyone. Nice to see you all. Thanks for the contributions. I guess it's a bit of a two question in one question. In relation to how much you compromise of the work or not, so the integrity of the work, and is around, so as organizers, how much are you ready to risk in the sense, so not to do with keeping integrity, but how much are you willing to risk in in putting something up, you know, and I mean risk in the broad sense of the word. You know, how much are you ready to deal with backlash from audiences, people you work with, authorities? I know this doesn't apply to everyone in every work, of course, but that's there, and often art does that and tends to, it can push the boundaries. It doesn't have to, but it can do that. So yeah, I guess is that, and then how do you negotiate that with the artists as well, you know? Which I guess it comes into the integrity side of things. Yeah, I don't know if it's a bit too broad. I can be more specific if necessary.
I think it's a really great question, and actually we're all dealing with it at every single level, you know, and it leads perfectly into the other question that I was going to prompt us to, which was this idea of lines and zones of responsibilities, and where does the buck stop and who's responsible for what. I don't want to take all the space, but does anyone have any musings or thoughts to Andre's question? Sadie?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and one that we've been thinking about a lot, about when you've built sort of a relationship with the council or someone who owns a space, and particularly if, you know, you have made agreements of sort of, if this happens, we will stop, you know, we will cancel the event, or we will stop at that moment, turn the music off, or whatever it is that's happening, and cancel it. Being actually in the moment and seeing people coming together and having a lovely time, how do you do that? And also my other musing was about how we're all online so much, and taking photos and videos, and I suppose that the sort of idea of backlash that you were saying, Andre, that if, you know, someone uploads a footage of an event that you've put on, and it seems you can see that people aren't social distancing and you haven't cancelled it, it's sort of all of those things that I suppose we're thinking about. And yeah, again, no answer, sadly. I wish there was an answer to it, I suppose, but yeah, it's sort of I suppose having quite open, if you can, or conversations with the people who own the space or the gatekeepers of that space about their expectation and your expectation, and yeah, how you're going to manage that. And yeah, I just think, yeah, the sort of feeling of seeing people being too close, or a group of over 6 people, how do you then tell the artist to, that's it, stop, you know, yeah, musings.
Thanks, Sadie. Come on in, Andre.
Sorry, just to say, obviously we are under COVID, and that is the overarching reality at the moment. But it was really a broad question beyond COVID, really. Just to say that, you know, obviously that is a big part at the moment, but, you know, I meant in generally, not just in relation to COVID.
Yeah.
Just to say that, just to add that.
Again, I mean, it's who is taking these risks as well. From a programmer's point of view, when we bring queer people of colour into Folkestone to do works in public space, we're asking them to take risks. We're also putting the audience at certain emotional risks. We're also putting ourselves in certain risks. And so I think it's a really pertinent question, both in relation to this unique pandemic context that we find ourselves in, but on a daily and an hourly basis as well. Like, whenever you're creating engaging work, you have to be considering risk in multiple forms for multiple parties. Otherwise, maybe we're just making collage. I don't know, like, yeah. Matthew.
Hi, I thought, well, I suppose fundamentally my response to this is, and having been in occasions of this sort, which is probably I'd go fairly far down the road up to the point where it becomes existential risk, because the point at which you actually just simply cannot do anything because you're prevented or you're closed down or your organization ceases to function, seems to me you've gone too far, because that means you have no potential for the future. So that's a kind of sort of very baseline concept about risk, which goes like, if this is going to destroy us all, probably don't go there. And then I think you can grade upwards from that, because I think threat is very significant, and there are certain occasions when you end up in situations where that is emotional or physical threat, and you need to take those things into account. So I think you do need to kind of like have a really quite hard-nosed viewpoint about what are the risks you are taking and who you are burdening that risk with. Because it is not merely yourself and your own organization or your bank balance, it is quite often multiple people, and those include audiences, and frankly they can also include somebody in the council who's gone to bat for you, who's then get on in a disciplinary, so it can also be the unexpected people who are taking risk on your behalf. So I think you have to kind of start at that baseline, which is existential, and work upwards. And mostly I think risk is about care. This is about how much do you care for all these people who you have relationships with. I think the second thing, and this I don't know this, I'm not absolutely sure of my own ground on this one, is around integrity, because I think one of the things that, and this is kind of where I started this evening, which is the idea that when you work in the outdoors, the fluidity of it is part and parcel of what you need to engage with. So the idea of integrity, which I strongly believe in, but integrity that is a fixed thing and is unable to respond to context, I don't think is terribly helpful when you're working in the outdoors. So it is kind of important that when you enter into a discussion about a piece of work, that actually even the fixed point may be something you need to discuss. So the idea has to come out of the world and the context of what being outdoors means. It is in itself part and parcel of your curatorial process, and I think that makes it a bit, in a sense, the question I would often ask people when I'm looking to work with is what is the change you're seeking to achieve, or is the impact you're seeking to make, and couch the discussion in those terms, and also who is the work for, and I think that helps a lot around. Perhaps, I don't know, I may be overstating this, but maybe just slightly takes the curse off that term integrity, because integrity does tend to feel about this is the need to drive a specific thing through. And I think in outdoor arts, it's just so dynamic, and it just involves needing to take on board so many different things, that actually the opportunity to kind of go to take that viewpoint that goes, I'm taking this, and it goes all the way through to the finish line, is just not as easy. It's a tricky world in which to work.
Thank you, Matthew. Does anyone have any further comments, queries, musings on the questions that Andre has raised or that we've raised between ourselves? We are actually coming towards time, so we've probably got about another 5-10 minutes for Q&A if we would like. Otherwise, we can, Diane.
I just Matthew, I thought you explained that really well, so thank you. I think the outdoors is different, and if I could ask you, Andre, when you're thinking about risk, what do you mean? Not what do you mean, but what prompted that? Is that because you think there isn't enough risk in work that's put outside? Or is it because you are also wondering about how to position things yourself outside? I'm thinking of the Puppet Festival last year, and how actually some of that work operated on many different levels, depending on the age of the audience. I think you're right, Matthew, this idea about integrity and it's such a difficult thing, isn't it? Because artists rightfully want to make the work that they want to make. And as producers or curators or gatekeepers, there are other responsibilities. And actually, I think it's more of this, isn't it? Most of the time, where maybe the artist and the producer doesn't tell you absolutely everything that's going to happen. Maybe you partly expect you don't know everything that's going to happen. And, you know, we work in this area because we have relationships and trust, and we want to see the work, you know, be in the world. But this other idea of the kind of encountered audience and how that lands for them, and then what it says about particular communities in their own, you know, sort of narrative, I think is an interesting area to push and pull at, but also something that does need to be, you know, care does need to be around it. So that was a long way of trying to understand a little bit more about what you were thinking about, Andre.
Yeah, can I just add then something to it, I guess, to explain a bit where the question came from. Because for me it's quite interesting, because obviously it came from both the place of me as an artist, and having done work, you know, in this, say, 10 years I've been doing stuff as an artist, where maybe some of the work has been maybe some people would say provocative or challenging, and now to you know, suddenly, for me it feels like a sudden thing to organize a puppet festival, you know, which is very much still in its infancy, but it is quite different than, you know, say when I was doing things in London Bridge, you know, during rush hour, for example, you know, and I give this just as an example because they are very different things. So, and he's navigating that. So for me, for example, as an artist, there has been works where I knew the risk that was involved, but I really wanted to do it, and I know what that might impart. And I did it on my own, basically. So I wasn't necessarily involving or asking anyone to be an accomplice of it, you know, because then I can take the responsibility myself as well. So he's also thinking about that responsibility. And obviously, I was just also generally curious as you guys as organizers, because I understand now that I do this festival, which is quite different for me to do. It is a different place to be, right? When you're organizing something, then you have a different type of responsibility, right? Because you're dealing with other people, because you have commitments with other people as well. Yeah, and things you agreed on, which was, I guess, what both you, Diane, and Matthew were also touching upon now. It's how far you're going to go, because then you are involving other people, you know. Say if I got in trouble in the past, it has happened that I, you know, end up having to deal with the police, for example. Nothing has gone that far that was, you know, proper trouble, but, you know, it was close, let's say. But that's very different now. If I organize the festival, I certainly don't go for it as myself as an artist, but rather someone who's also responsible for artists and for the people I work with. For example, you know, because obviously I did the festival in the Harbour, so it's very different because I know I'm dealing with you and all the other people there and involved. So it was just that, really, just out of curiosity, obviously, because I know there's very different approaches, and me being on both sides of the barricade, there's both an artist and someone organizing a festival, and my practice is quite different than what the festival is as well, which is, yeah, just that, really. So, but it makes sense, yeah, because I guess as an artist, sorry, and I'll stop here so it doesn't go too long, I definitely am way more willing to go further as an artist than as an organizer. But as an artist, I see the issues of people who organize things having their own limitations. Does it make sense? And I don't have an answer either, you know, I suppose, you know. So yeah, just that.
Thank you, Andre. Matthew, could I just bring in one of the chat topics? We've just had a contribution in the chat that I'd just like to bring in. It's from Lucy. Lucy has written, just amusing, there is a brilliant notion about watching performance isn't an offer to switch off, but rather it's something that would wake us up, switch us on. There is so much that I have seen in Folkestone that does that, that provides an opportunity for us to talk and open and leave with an open heart, with a want to learn more and discover more. I'm struggling with the amount of online emphasized time we are all experiencing right now, that the opportunity to be outside is what I'm longing for. But the opportunity to discuss and chat with fellow theatre performance goers after the performance, which I love, won't be there. Or if it is, it won't be the same. How can we give that space, the after space for the chat, as often it is just as important as the performance itself. P.S. These evenings are amazing and ironic in what I've just said, but I'm so grateful. Thank you, Lucy. I hope I did that justice. And it's very true, because we're drawing this to a close, and it would be great to continue all of these conversations in the pub or in the cafe or walking down to the beach. But we're in these little parametered boxes that have time allocations that disappear, and then we all just switch off. So I think it is a really, really important comment. Thank you, Lucy. Matthew, if you would like the closing word, I'll draw this evening to a close after we have your final contribution. Then we'll hand back to Karen.
I was just going to say more in response to Andre really than anything, but I do think in outdoor arts there is a kind of it's a kind of trick, and the trick is that you are creating something that is very easily accessible, that is very welcoming, that is warm, that is friendly, and as people edge their way towards this stuff, sometimes unknowingly and unwittingly and accidentally, what they then discover is those things that we want to talk about and that are important to talk about. And the irony of many other forms of art is that they have very explicit descriptions on their covers, whether they are theatres or galleries or what have you, that are many times quite off-putting. And what outdoor arts is it a place that gives you it's an easy way of coming towards something, and it gentles you into an environment. And actually, no ideas are barred in outdoor arts at all, but the techniques around outdoor arts is what draws people into it. And that's when they go away kind of going, oh, actually, I have been changed. I have found something different. And these are often the people that would never ever cross a theatre door, would never ever go through a gallery door. And that's why I think it's particularly important. And actually, it's why I think it's probably one of the biggest catalysts for change in the arts. Is that good enough to sum it up for now?
Thank you, Matthew. So, is public space safe for everyone? Who knows? Let's take more risks and let's do it together while we're making rad performance. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Sadie. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Diane. And thank you, Andre and Lucy, for your contributions. This evening's been wonderful, and that draws it to a close. Thank you to all our wonderful guests as well.